Final Fantasy VIII is for many players a game of ambiguities, a story that relies on subtlety and sleight of hand to make sense of, and player investment to truly understand. It is perhaps why Final Fantasy VIII is so divisive. You are either on board with working out the story for yourself, or you are not. Yet, beyond the core story, Final Fantasy VIII as a world and setting comprises some of the most mysterious, unexplained phenomena to feature in a Final Fantasy game, a dense lore of natural mechanisms that quite simply are, and have served an intriguing basis for fan theories, fictions, and indeed desire for a remake to expand on these elements over the past few decades. So what are the enduring mysteries of Final Fantasy VIII? How do they add or detract from our impression of the game? And how do they contribute to the unique legacy of the title so many years later? Jumping right in and starting with elements that contribute most to the macro setting and backdrop of the game, we have the sparsely explored concept of Great Hyne. And just to recap, Great Hyne is mentioned a couple of times in-game as an obscure deity or creator god. There are a couple of folk tales about him creating mankind that we can hear from NPCs, and there was some cut content available in the Japanese Ultimania where we learn about him during a Balam Garden classroom exercise. But other than that, very little is mentioned on Hyne, which leads to fan speculation, fan fictions springing up in subsequent years to fill the void, including my very own Final Fantasy VIII sequel speculation that I did some time ago, and I'll drop a link to that below. So, while it's an ambiguous entity, the most tangible impact that Hyne has on the main game events is being the creator god of the sorceresses, who are sometimes known as descendants of Hyne. And this alone, I think, validates his reason for being mentioned at all, since sorceresses are a core component of Final Fantasy VIII's world and story, and the inclusion of a godlike being such as Hyne really augments the more magical, esoteric fantasy side of Final Fantasy VIII that combines with its more overt futurism to create the unique experience that it is. Adjacent to Hyne and the sorceresses is another big mystery central to Final Fantasy VIII, which is the character of Ellone. And Ellone remains, I think, one of the biggest ambiguities of the game because her supernatural abilities are so integral to it. It's also somewhat frustrating because while everything from the sorceresses to the time loops to the geopolitics are accounted for and explained in Final Fantasy VIII, whether discreetly or not, Ellone's powers of junctioning is the one thing that isn't, which, again, owing to her proximity to the central story, being the entire reason for Ultimecia travelling back through time, commandeering the Galbadian military, being the reason that Squall can connect to Laguna's past, and so on. Virtually everything of significance in Final Fantasy VIII's core story beats hinges on Ellone's ability to junction people's consciousness through time and to other people. And yet it's left alone by the writing team as an ambiguity for audiences to speculate upon. And many theories exist to this day, ranging from Ellone perhaps partly being a guardian force, or Ellone being related to the sorceresses or Great Hyne, which are the closest supernatural elements that we have in the game. But ultimately, it remains an enduring mystery that is never adequately explained. Next, we have the lunar cry, and Final Fantasy VIII has a very curious use of the moon here. Many Final Fantasy games feature the moon and space exploration as an aspect of the story, but Final Fantasy VIII is almost certainly the weirdest, and what we have here is a periodic extinction event where the moon, which is not dissimilar in form or proximity or appearance to the real Earth's actual moon, but in Final Fantasy VIII it has a concentration of monsters that periodically appear on its surface and form this gravitational funnel down to Earth, causing it to rain monsters onto the planet, creating huge civilization-destroying events on the surface of the Earth. Not being a physics expert, one can only suppose that the gravity and tidal behaviours on Final Fantasy VIII's planet are pretty insane, but nonetheless the lunar cry forms an important aspect of the world building and actually later game plot events that build out the story of Final Fantasy VIII, and also explains why the world is full of monsters, which is not often the case when we look at fiends or monsters appearing across different Final Fantasy games. In relation to the Lunar Cry, we have the Centra, who are often described as an ancient race who were wiped out by Lunar Cry, and yet the mysterious thing about this civilization is while they seem antiquated, if technologically advanced, in-game dialogues contradict one another by saying they were wiped out around 80 to 100 years ago. This drastically compresses the timeline of Final Fantasy VIII, and considering nobody alive in the game seems to have known or indeed is a descendant of the Centra, we are left to suppose that modern societies like Galbadia or Dole are either super new, having sprung up within the past 100 years, or perhaps, which is more likely I think, is a translation or writing error occurred when describing this timeline, because the Centra ruins, Idia's orphanage for example, all of the Centra artefacts we see in the game are built with a very rudimentary Romanesque sort of stonework that seems maybe 1,000 years old rather than 100 years old, particularly when looking at their proximity to civilizations like Esthar. Bit of an oversight there, and definitely a mystery surrounding the Centra if indeed they are only 100 years extinct. Coming to the final major mystery before touching on some of the smaller elements we have is Squall's ring, Griever. Now, this is probably more of a miscommunication than a mystery, but the significance of Griever, the ability to name it as an accessory, the fact it features as an end boss, was a source of huge confusion for many and a cause of fan theories for others. Now, Griever features maybe 3 times in the game. Firstly during the Battle of the Gardens, where Zell wants to use this very inopportune moment to borrow the ring so that he can secretly make a copy while he's crushing on Rinoa. And this is something that we see during Ellone's flashback later too. Shortly after this, outside Galbadia Garden, Rinoa returns Griever, and here we have the opportunity to name it. And then jumping forward right to the end of the game, Ultimecia summons Griever, or whatever we happen to have named it, to battle us. And this final instance is what causes most confusion, owing in part to rather woolly translations. But the Japanese text does infer quite heavily, and indeed clarify, that Ultimecia is summoning Griever from Squall's subconscious, and Griever is essentially Squall's values and virtues that he has symbolically manifested in the guise of this lionesque creature. So, by no means the worst mystery, it's simply a lesser explained one, and was much more of a curveball for the audience because of the undue attention that Griever is given during the Battle of the Gardens and basically nowhere else. Coming on to the lesser mysteries of Final Fantasy VIII, we have side quest material that builds out this strange juxtaposing world. For example, secrets like the Obel Lake mystery or the Windhill Mansion quest, where we periodically see Raine's ghost, lean into the strange supernaturalism about the world, while others, such as the friendly space invader PuPu in his flying saucer, lends to the futuristic space travel side of Final Fantasy VIII that, much like the archaic sorceresses and Great Hyne, combines with things like the Lunar Cry and high-tech cities like Esthar to create the strange and mysterious world that Final Fantasy VIII ultimately is. So, ultimately a title that comprises threads of ambiguous, often conflicting or unexplained lore that one can either get behind or not. It is ultimately a rich tapestry of old and new, tenuously connected, but never outrightly explained, in elements that are built in service of a single thrust of story, which is what happens when Squall meets Rinoa. Thanks for watching. If you enjoyed the episode, please consider joining me on Patreon, or if you'd like to buy me a coffee, you can do so. The links are available below.